as I say, well, this is a meeting sponsored by Policy Exchange to discuss the state of police and crime commissioners 1 year on, rather 10 months on. I assume that everyone in the room knows what a PCC is, in which case you're in a vast, tiny minority in this country. But as we know, your PCCs were set up to set local policing priorities and to hold local forces to account, and they have the power to hire and fire chief constables. Both Labour and Conservatives have acknowledged in the past that once national targets, home office targets for police were scrapped, then there needed to be some method of democratic accountability to drive up police performance locally and to hold local forces to account. Labour, I think, were committed in the past to elected police authority chairman and Victoria's brought in PCCs. The elections last November, we know what happened there. Lowest turnout in lowest turnout in peacetime history. We more recently learned that from the electoral commissions that candidates spent just over £2.1 million in getting themselves elected, although obviously they cost a lot more to stage. One Conservative, Craig McKinley in Kent, managed to spend £98,000 on his campaign, and he failed to get elected. He was actually beaten by Anne Barnes, who was the independent and had previously been the police authority chair. His £98,000 was almost as much as the entire outlay by Lib Dem candidates on their entire campaign. They spent £110,000 in total, which demonstrated their commitment, shall we say, to the idea. But since perhaps I would argue that the Lib Dems were responsible for the elections being held in November in the first place, you could say that they did their level best to sabotage the process. Last week in Glasgow, I sensed quite a degree of hostility still to PCCs, and perhaps because with one or two closet exceptions, they don't have any Liberal Lib Dem PCCs, but they seem to be they would be happy to go into an election, I think, almost wanting to scrap them, although Jeremy Brown was keen to dispel that idea. So it's been a difficult birth. There's been, as we all know, some high-profile disputes between commissioners and their chief constables over who should be hired and fired, to such an extent that ACPO has recently suggested to the Home Secretary that some kind of national arbitration service should be set up to replace the role that the Manchester Inspector of Constabulary used to do in mediating relations between police authorities and chief constables, and no longer exist. As I say, the system isn't without its critics. Perhaps most surprisingly, its most fiercest critic I've come across is Bob Jones, who's the chairman of who is the West Midlands PCC, the largest force in the country, who recently, early this month, he actually wrote this article in which he argued that after 9 months of the job, I see no evidence that PCCs are an improvement on previous police authorities. Commissioners are higher profile, but actually have fewer tools to hold their force to account. He actually said that he argued that his job should be scrapped. And David Hanson here has told me that he hopes to become a quiz question in the future of who was the one and only West Midlands PCC in history. Even Theresa May has recently had a go in her speech to the Police Superintendents Association a couple of weeks ago, where, as I say, the whole point of PCCs is to provide that area of democratic accountability and drive up police performance after the scrapping of national targets, when she complained that targets were making a comeback through the back door, so to speak. And I think subsequent BBC FOI showed that there were like sort of 178 targets now being put in place by about half the PCCs. Interestingly, a subsequent further analysis of those PCCs seemed to show that the majority of them were actually Conservative PCCs who had reintroduced targets, and so she in effect was attacking her own PCCs. Well, to discuss these questions and to look at how the role of PCCs might develop in the future, we have an excellent panel here. On my left here is David Hanson, who's Labour's Shadow Policing Minister, who had a distinguished ministerial career at the Home Office as the Minister for Policing, Crime and Security, and at the Ministry of Justice and the Northern Ireland Office. To his left is Tony Lloyd, who stood down as an MP after 20 years in Parliament and successfully fought the election to become the Labour PCC for Greater Manchester. He's equally distinguished former Foreign Office Minister and a former chairman of the Parliamentary Labour Party. Olly Martins, on my right, spent 8 years working for Victim Support before he was elected as Labour's PCC in Bedfordshire last November. I'm told he serves in the TA and was last year mobilised as a UN peacekeeper in Cyprus, so maybe you could take on that. Maybe you could take on that arbitration role as you all wants to see adopted. And finally, on my right is Max Chambers, who's the head of crime and justice at Policy Exchange, the think tank that many credit with the idea of developing the idea of PCCs. Max has authored 7 reports on 20 reports on police reform and criminal justice and health. So I'll ask each of the panel to make a few opening remarks. So before we move to a more general discussion, would you like to start, please?
Thanks, Alan. Thanks, colleagues, for coming at this time of the morning. It's one of the great ironies of the Police and Crime Commissioner elections that the Labour Party opposed the creation of the post, fought very vigorously through Parliament to stop the creation of the post, but actually at the election was one of the contributing factors to making the elections a limited success in terms of the turnout. If we hadn't have participated, it would have been a much more difficult, challenging election than even it was, as Alan has described to date. We put a lot of effort and time into selecting candidates, of which 2 successful candidates are here. We put a lot of time ensuring that we had quality candidates. We actually got 13 candidates elected across England and Wales, including, rather like Tony's as well, a range of forces, from very large forces like West Midlands and Greater Manchester through to forces in the south like Bedfordshire and smaller forces in the north like Durham. So we've had a very checkered career with police and crime commissioners, and I want to say now that from my perspective, I think the crime commissioners that are in place, from what I've seen of what they're doing and from talking to Tony as chair particularly, are trying their best to fulfil the role in the way in which it was envisaged to make a difference, but using that role with Labour values to try to put priorities for the Labour government in place on policing issues at a time when we have major cuts in public spending, major changes. And if I've got one criticism of the government, which is an unusual criticism in that their whole approach to policing has been a massive change over the last 3 years. I don't really think, whatever we argue today, that they have actually committed themselves to making the PCC work in an effective way. They haven't driven through that agenda in the way in which I would have thought they would have done, given it being a flagship policy. My colleagues, like Tony and Olly, will talk about what PCCs are doing, but I know that now Vera Baird, for example, in Northumberland is doing very innovative work on domestic violence. We've got links to local restorative justice from police and crime commissioners from Labour. We've got greater involvement and partnership with the voluntary sector. We've got drugs prevention work. We've got the private sector with Bob, even though he's said that he's against the principle of PCCs. His first act as PCC was to stop a private sector wholesale contract. We're pushing out a range of activity to the private sector, which Birmingham and West Midlands had planned to do. There's innovation, there's efficiency, and my colleagues are working hard to deliver for Labour values in the settings and the powers that they've got. But that leads me really to effectively, and this is the purpose of our debate, to look at what are the future challenges and whether or not police and crime commissioners in their current form are the vehicle for those future challenges. We have now, I think, rising crime in certain areas, acquisitive crime, food theft. We have new emerging crime issues on fraud, on terrorism, on cybercrime. We have this whole tension which is there between what is the local agenda that Tony and Olly will set in their respective forces versus what is the role of the Home Office in the centre. And as a Labour Party, we're going to face an election in 18 months' time, which if we win, I don't yet know what the landscape of policing and criminal justice is going to be in 18 months' time, because we have many of the tools, potentially with the probation service, with prisons, with the National Health Service, to tackle mental health and other issues and drug issues, being more and more fragmented by a government that is committed to localism, but appears to be standing back centrally from the Home Office, Ministry of Justice and other roles in having a coordinating role on how we tackle crime and criminal justice issues. So we have to look at, in Labour Party terms, not just where we are now, but where we're going to be in 18 months' time and what the Labour agenda is for that. And to help us with that, and this is why I don't have answers today, Alan, on some of these issues, but I want to place the challenges. We've established the Stevens Commission under Lord Stevens with a number of academics and involved the police practitioners and a range of individuals to look at what we think are those challenges independently of Labour. That will report later this year. But it's going to look at a number of key issues, which include the 21st century policing, how we develop policing leadership skills, how we professionalise the service and build on the College of Policing, what we do about standards and the Independent Police Complaints Commission, how we can look at the efficiencies, which at the moment, again, there is a temptation with 43 commissioners to not go down that efficiency route or to have much more independence on that efficiency, but on procurement, on force cooperation and on collaboration. What we do about those new challenges of cyber, fraud and terrorism, and also how we have a relationship and what that relationship is with the private sector and private sector providers. And I think there are key issues around governance and around how we relate to the private sector that I think the new incoming Labour Home Office would want to look at in terms of contract length, in terms of scope and in terms of accountability for that sector. And it will crucially look at the issue of governance, and Tony and Olly know it will do that. And essentially, just so I put my cards on the table, we have really effectively three options. We have the total status quo, which is let's define better the role of the Home Office. Let's give some central direction from the Home Office rather than just laissez-faire. But let's let the local police and crime commissioners do what they want to do now within a police and crime commissioner model as currently is. Second option for us effectively will be, should we amend the current model in some way, shape or form? That might be, for example, should we look at strengthening police and crime panels? Should we look at a different model of engagement with local authorities? Should we look at some type of local council engagement? Should we look at basing additional help and support at neighbourhood policing level where most people relate to anyway, which is their force in Luton or their force in Salford, rather than the Greater Manchester or Bedfordshire force? Should we look at that? And the third model is really the policy exchange issue, which is should we look at widening this role to make the and crime bit a much more effective model by looking at whether or not, whatever we inherit in 18 months' time on probation, that we give extra powers to police and crime commissioners to deal with those issues. Now, we're not going to make a decision on that yet, and I think I welcome the policy exchange's contribution to that additional model. It may be a super commissioner too far, I'm not going to rule it out yet, but it's certainly worth examination. But we have to, as a Labour Party, and this is my crucial point, is not today, Alan, because we can't, but when Stevens reports on all those challenges and all those issues, including governance, I know that the police and crime commissioners, the Labour Party and others will want to engage as to what an incoming Labour government should do. We have the next election for police and crime commissioners currently planned for May 2016. That's a very tight timescale anyway between a general election and a future police and crime commissioner election. We have again options there to either have a first year criminal justice bill looking at whatever changes for May 16, or we have the option of delaying the election to May 17 and making changes in between. Who knows? My bid today is not that we have a solution, but I want to look at effectively the challenges. And the challenges for me, in summary, are we're going to have still a very severe financial situation. We're going to have a very fragmented, much more localised criminal justice system as a whole. And I want to make changes that reduce reoffending, that reduce crime, that build public confidence, that make people feel engaged with the CJS as a whole, and which deliver a better service in a much more coordinated way from the centre, as well as engaging localism. And we have to decide clearly what we do about this post in that next 18-month, 12-month period. This time next year, this party conference has to come to a conclusion about those issues. And I want to create a debate with colleagues about that and hear what both PCCs say, but also particularly what the people who deal with PCCs say, because ultimately it's about the consumer end of this business, not what I think, and not what, with due respect to Tony and Olly think.
Thank you, David. I think it was a very frank and interesting outline of where Labour policy stands at the moment. Maybe invite Tony to talk about your experience of how you think it's working on the ground and how it might develop in the future.
No, thanks, Alan. One of my favourite stories, although I don't know if it's really true, was when Zhou Enlai, the then Chinese Prime Minister, was asked about what he thought about the French Revolution, and he said it's too soon to answer. And I mean, what probably is the case is that it is quite difficult to give the definitive view about the experience of the Police and Crime Commissioner model. But like a lot of things in life, I mean, Labour has a history, but governments generally have a history of interfering structurally without working out, first of all, what it is we want the structure to deliver. And I think in practice, where I move to now is rather like David's own framework on this. I mean, I actually voted against the creation of police and crime commissions in Parliament, a loyal Labour member of Parliament, as I was at the time. And there are structural weaknesses in the model in any case that at some point have to be attended to, because the power invested in any one person to use that power in an arbitrary fashion can be dangerous. And I would instance that actually by a real example. There is one, not exactly police and crime commissioner, but one person has pretty much that role, who's actually got rid of 2 effective chief constables, because that's Boris Johnson. Boris has sacked 2 Metropolitan Police Commissioners, the chief constable equivalent. One is casual, 2 is beginning to look like he's got form on the subject. So there is real danger in having one person who has the capacity to arbitrarily exercise power. And we do have to look at, I think, in the longer run, if we were to keep the directly elected commissioner model, what kind of checks and balances ought to be provided there. But that said, that's not necessarily a criticism or a critique of the existing commissioners. There have been a number of high-profile cases, obviously, but actually each of those has to be answered locally and individually, because come what may, as long as we have local police forces, governance of those police forces has to be delivered at local level. We have to work out what that means. But let's go back and ask the question about what do we look for now in terms of the police and crime governance role? And if we look at across the board, I think one of the things that has struck me, it's absolutely right for David to evidence a number of good examples of where Labour police and crime commissioners are using that role to make a difference. There is doing good work in areas around domestic abuse, other commissioners on different aspects of the sorts of things that ought to trouble our society, not simply people within the Labour Party. But the central issue for me, in actual fact, when I look at how we deliver safer communities, is in fact how we build the institutional and organisational partnerships that can actually practically make a difference. And I'm probably the most advantaged commissioner in this sense, because the most immediate partner for police and crime commissioners are the local authorities. They're not the only partner, but the most immediate partner. I probably have the most cohesive local government system anywhere in England and Wales, in Greater Manchester, where the Association of Greater Manchester Authorities probably act more cohesively than any comparable body. So I'm lucky to that extent, and it gives a good platform for that partnership working. And a partnership process that's got to involve, for example, what we will find emerging from the reforms in the probation service coming through, to work, for example, with the structural crime prosecution service through the court process into our prisons. I met last week, in fact, the people who provide prison education in my own area. I mean, just a small detail, but to give an example, one of the issues that really does matter is the capacity to passport the education and training that a prisoner has had inside prison as that person is released. If we're talking properly about a through the gate policy, it's got to be integrated. So education, access to drug treatment, maybe alcohol treatment services, mental health services, all of those things have to be structured in a way that we can see the totality of the the correctional process, if that's the right word. In any case, if we were to break the cycle of reoffending, that partnership working has to trace all the way through those processes. In an equivalent way, I'm trying to build partnerships now with the mental health services across Greater Manchester. We know that of the things that occupy policing time, when I look at the major incident log on any day, people would probably be surprised to know that amongst the most common things that are there aren't armed robbery or heinous violent crime whatsoever. It is the missing person. It's the person with dementia. It's the person sometimes who, for different reasons, wants to jump off literally a motorway bridge at 4 o'clock in the morning. And of course, all of those are demanders of police time. So even in a driving inefficiency into the service, I don't want Greater Manchester police officers being yes, they must be the first responders to that kind of event, because that's what the flashing blue light does. But actually, very quickly, that person who needs actually mental health services wants rapid passport through to those appropriate mental health services. The pattern I'm trying to build up is one where building these partnerships across the whole of the framework is absolutely central to the community safety agenda. And if we look at the police and crime bit of the title, then the kind of conclusions the policy exchange actually drew. Now, I'm not convinced that policy exchange sets a rather high hurdle for any government, Labour or Conservative. I suppose I did have a brief exchange when Mr. Grayling, the present Justice Secretary, did express some scepticism about the policy exchange.
His favourite report.
Indeed. But we've got to look at what policy exchange we're trying to do with the established, because what I'm describing is that at the moment that patchwork quilt of sometimes joined up but sometimes rather ragged service connection is one that we can't afford if we're to do the community safety thing properly, particularly actually frankly at a time of austerity. But even if it weren't a time of austerity, the systems thinking process is exactly where we ought to be in terms of modern society, and of making genuine difference in preventing crime in the first place, in preventing reoffending, etc. So that's where the organisational question ought to lie. How do we achieve the governance structure that allows us to build that partnership process? Now, I think, of course, I would say is that the commissioner model actually has genuinely something to offer there. What are the downsides? Well, let me just challenge a little bit, not to David, but to the other models. I think there probably is very little appetite at the moment, for example, for the creation of a totally national policing service. So come what may, we are talking about delivery of some form of localism. You can talk about reform, you can talk about amalgamation of individual police forces. But nevertheless, if we're not looking at a national service, then we are looking at localism of some kind. Once you establish you're looking at localism, then what are the prerequisites for that governance structure? Can it be referred? Well, frankly, the police authority structure was not actually really a marvellous example of oversight. Now, I don't say there's some criticism of my own forebears, or however they might be described as. I think Bob Jones is actually fundamentally wrong. The police authority system was out of sight. It wasn't accountable. It wasn't even accountable, frankly, to the local government system that it notionally served. Very often, and I say this rather unfairly, there were some very good people who worked on police authorities, but there were some people who were put there simply because it was a time-serving way of getting rid of the either rivals or those who fulfilled another role. Now, that's an unkind characterisation, but it's true. We can't go back to that kind of model. The benefit of a directly elected commission, I think, of these is it does give individual accountability and individual responsibility, the kind that other structures don't have. The disadvantage, of course, is that if we continue to have this as with the kind of disastrous turnouts that we had at the last election, it is difficult for the public to relate to that electoral process, and therefore to invest the individual candidate with the moral authority and the political authority to use that power. But I would even there give a caution, because if you were to look at the very few people would dispute the mandate that Boris Johnson has as Mayor of London. Boris's actual share of the London electorate was much smaller than probably people imagine. It wasn't as small as my share, by the way. But I think it is true I have the second highest individual vote of anybody in England and Wales. I think that's true. Mine after Boris's.
Was that fewer than your constituency in?
No, it's massively more than my constituency, but there are 2.7 million people with fans in Greater Manchester, and my constituency is very big, it's 90,000.
No, I meant when you were an MP. Well, did more people vote for you as an MP than actually voted for you as PCC?
Many more people voted for me as PCC because you trust only Greater Manchester. But what is true, the proportion who voted for me was far higher as an MP. I was a much better MP candidate than a PCC candidate.
Just a question, Tony. I mean, David touched on it before, that people see the way PCC seems to be caught between the national and the very local. If you're going to have a localist model, then, as David mentioned, it's neighbourhood policing that people relate to in terms of the police. They don't necessarily relate to. I guess that if you're in Bury or in Stockport or you're in Salford, you don't really care whether it's Greater Manchester is on the badge. But how do PCCs relate to that local neighbourhood level? I mean, last week in Glasgow, I had many Liberal Democrat councillors ringing up and say, well, we just ignored our PCC, and someone said, well, I went to a PCC consultation meeting, I had to get in the car and drive 40 miles, and they had no idea where I lived at all, or what had been happening where I lived, albeit in a large shire force area. How can PCCs build support and connect to that neighbourhood?
Well, I mean, partly, I mean, look, I kind of grew up in Greater Manchester, I probably know that it is geographically small, but it's the, actually, along with the West Midlands, it is the biggest, we're roughly the same as the West Midlands in population. I can't know 2.7 million people, but actually I can't know 0.7 million people either individually. I can know the community structures that build up, but of course, like anything, if you put it with any direct, well, I mean, David knows this as a member of Parliament. You can't actually know every bit of your constituency, every street, every house. But you can work with those who do with the community structures. So, for example, recently I had all the home watches across Greater Manchester represented in the same room. I talked to victims groups across the different communities. I talk to community and residence groups and whatever. I mean, political communication is the same, frankly, whether you're a police and crime commissioner or a member of parliament or a local councillor. Again, I mean, use the model. I mean, I'm not necessarily trying to oversell this, but in the same way, that question probably would no longer be asked about the Mayor of London. Does the Mayor of London have a referential base? London is 4 times as big as Greater Manchester. I have my own views about Boris Johnson's politics. I don't doubt Boris's mandate or his capacity to use that mandate on behalf of the people of London. And I would say the same thing. I mean, the advantage to, and it's almost the answer to what you're posing. If yes, of course, we could have even more localism. We could go down to the basic command unit level of policing. In actual fact, neighbourhood policing doesn't even work without there are 11 divisions in Greater Manchester, so you can say, roughly speaking, we're talking about population structures of 250,000 people. Actually, neighbourhood policing is delivered much more locally than that. Much more locally. We've got a pilot in parts of
the control team is only going to be 4 or 5 people.
Yeah, absolutely. Anyway, I mean, I could go on. I've probably exhausted my 5 or 6
minutes. At the other end, let's move to Olly now, perhaps, on the other end of the scale, Bedfordshire being one of the smallest forces.
Certainly at the other end of the scale in a number of different ways. Bedfordshire's got a population of just around 600,000. Got a police force of about 1,100 officers on the downward trend, just over 1,000 at the moment. And about 1,000 staff. I think what's interesting about Bedfordshire, though, is that it is, even though it's small, it's like the country in microcosm. So at the south of the county, you've got Luton, where I live, which is effectively like a London borough, just not in London. And then you've got everything between up to the north of the county, which is extremely rural. And that poses quite a few sort of policing challenges, really. And then you've got all the transport links that go through the county. So anyone who's got to go back home up north will probably be going through Bedfordshire. Just don't blink, otherwise you might miss it. And as well as that, because of really Luton, we have a lot of what you might consider urban challenges, but the funding we get is more what you consider at the rural end of the scale. So it's quite a challenging place. If I just go back though to what David was saying about the election, there's one thing you forgot to mention, David, about the Labour Party in the PCC election, and that's that we won it. We got the largest national share of the vote. Now it might not, only getting 13 out of 41 might not have felt like winning, but I think we need to bear that in mind, and that is now reflected in the fact that yes, we've got 13 police and crime commissioners, but we represent. We've got Tiddly Bedfordshire, yes, but we've also got Tony Lloyd, Greater Manchester. We've got Jane Kennedy in Merseyside. We've got Bob Jones in West Midlands. We've got the largest chunk of the population. We've got we are responsible for policing 18.6 million people. We've got a combined budget of 3.7 billion. But I don't know if it's going to be the same. Clearly the PCCs were invisible at the DEM conference, we can understand that, but we also appear to be a bit, apart from events like this, we also appear to be a bit invisible at Labour Party conference as well. The hardly got a mention at my regional reception. I went to the Welsh night to talk to Brother Michael, it was the same there. I think we do, yes, we want to get a change of government, but in the meantime, in the next 18 months, we've got 13 people who are working very hard in pretty influential positions to apply our Labour values. And I think it's important to remember that. Going back to Bedfordshire, unusually, I think most PCC candidates, and probably most PCCs that were elected on the basis of protecting neighbourhood policing. Unfortunately, in Bedfordshire, because of that funding situation that I described, by the time I arrived as Police and Crime Commissioner, the previous police authority and the Chief Constable had to abandon neighbourhood policing. So we don't have really what's neighbourhood policing in Bedfordshire. We have PCSOs, but another part of the legacy that I've inherited is that we have a very low number of PCSOs compared to the national average. So the only sort of element of local policing as such that we have is delivered by overstretched PCSOs. However, the new model that was implemented just before I took office, which operates on what they call a threat harm risk model, has succeeded in driving down crime in the county by a higher rate in the last 2 or 3 years than we've seen nationally. So I think we've managed to reduce crime by about 12% compared to 6%. So even though we don't have neighbourhood policing, we do have what appears to be, in terms of reducing crime, a very successful model. However, the downside of that is that it's had a pretty, I think, detrimental impact on the visibility of the force, and that is something that I'm trying to address as Police and Crime Commissioner, because I spend a lot of time talking to people in Luton and around the county, and what they are saying is, we don't see our police, we want to see our police. And it is a bit of a conundrum that you've got a model that is targeting the crime issues and is succeeding in addressing the crime issues in terms of reducing crime, but it's not doing a great deal for public confidence in the force. And ultimately, if we're going to sustain the downward trend in crime at a time when police budgets are being cut and when force strength is in decline, certainly the regular force strength is in decline, then what I'm saying is that we need the strongest possible partnership between the public and their police. And we therefore do need to address this issue of public confidence in the force. So that's why I inherited the decision to actually cut our small number of PCSOs. I was able to reverse that, and we are also seeking to double the size of our special constabulary. And whereas the special constabulary have historically been, well, spend a lot of their time policing the nighttime economy, I'm developing a separate strand that is actually going to put special constables effectively into neighbourhood policing, a more geographically focused, community focused role, in order to address that issue about visibility, and in order to try and develop what I describe as confident communities that will work closely with the force and keep that downward crime trend going. I've also, I'm quite an advocate for the use of technology, and particularly GPS tagging. When I was elected last November, the force had waiting on the blocks. They've already used the IOM scheme in Bedfordshire already uses GPS tagging on a voluntary basis, and they've seen some very successful results. So for some particularly persistent and prolific offenders, I think there was a group of 14 that were tagged. These 14 people were responsible for, I think, 459 crimes before they were tagged. In the period while they were tagged, one of them was responsible for 3 crimes, and the rest managed to stay crime-free. So it seems it's quite a powerful tool to stop offending while they're tagged, but also to support rehabilitation and to affect their behaviour in that way. Now, the pilot that the force have been wanting to run was to move from volunteers to compulsory tagging for people being released on licence and people being bailed pending sentence. And we had all the partners, probation, local authorities, the courts, ready to and willing and wanting to try this pilot, because everyone had seen the success that the voluntary pilot had. But unfortunately they were hitting their heads against a brick wall with the Ministry of Justice, who I think following this order, particularly following the West Coast Main Line franchising.
Yeah, there's obviously a national contract procurement question as close as local ordering. We saw the NO report last week, which said that forces have such wide variation in local purchasing that they're spending between, I can't remember the exact figures, but even a standard pair of police boots cost between, what was it, £20 and £80, a variation in which obviously a huge waste of money going on. Olly, thank you for giving us the nuts and bolts of how it's working in a smaller force. Max, perhaps I could ask you to make your pitch to Labour as to why they should adopt a policy for super commissioners at the next election.
Yeah, so I'll try and be quick so we've got time for questions. I suppose the point of our report was, and interesting to hear what you say about, you don't feel that the Home Office and the MOJ have driven through the reform yet, and maybe gone as far as they might have done. I think we probably have the same kind of feeling, and that I suppose there are two challenges, both I think are about how the rest of the system can make room for PCCs. So one of those is at a national level. So how do you get MOJ and how do you get Home Office to properly take account of the fact that PCCs exist, make room for them in the policy making process, think about them when they're doing procurements and all the rest of it. And then at a local level, it's great that Tony has got such well-established partnership arrangements locally, but a lot of the PCCs I talk to are, even now, almost a year in, closed out of those kind of fora. So they're not allowed to be part of health and wellbeing boards. There's CPS preventing them from sitting on the local criminal justice board. and they're just not able to play in that wider space where actually most of the PCCs that you talk to think that's the biggest potential. That's where the potential lies for the development of that role, and that's where they can make the biggest difference in brokering agreements between different agencies, even going as far as doing things like pooling budgets and really trying to move resources around to make sure that the social problems relating to crime are tackled. So, and I'm not sure what the answer is, and our report was a way of trying to start that debate. Is it about giving PCCs formal responsibility for things like early intervention and problem families and probation and prisons and all these different things? I'm not sure if that's necessarily going to work for everybody in every area, but it was trying to start that debate, and I think so. The idea of super PCCs was trying to say, there are PCCs who have these arrangements where things are already well developed and well established. Let's give them some rocket boosters and see what how far they can take this model, and how far we can really develop a properly integrated joined up response to crime, and then maybe that will give some of the answers that David's searching for in terms of what the future evolution of the model might be. I'll stop there, so we've got time for a bit of discussion. But that was the idea, and of course there are all sorts of issues around the police accountability bit. And, how do you get that right? How do you make sure that we don't have this huge turnover of chief constables and these issues like we've seen in Gwent and elsewhere? So it's good that the Home Affairs Select Committee are looking at that. It's good that Stephen's looking at that, and I don't think Policy Exchange or the government are particularly dogmatic about saying the model as is absolutely perfect. But I think what we were trying to do is trying to start a debate about future development rather than what I think we've seen in the media so far, which is very much about do we even want PCCs at all? I think it's probably better that we start thinking about how to make the model work rather than taking retrograde steps.
Thank you, Max. Can I there's one question which just check with David here. In any discussion of policing, soon comes round to the question of mergers outside of the big city and urban forces, and everyone always assumes that politically mergers are off the agenda, and that neither Labour nor Tories are going to commit themselves to pushing through police force mergers. Is that the case, David?
Well, actually, one of my last acts as the police minister was to give £1 million to Hertfordshire and Bedfordshire to try and force a merger between them, and actually at a political level at that stage, the chief constables wanted to merge, and the two chairs of the police authorities vetoed the merger at the time. I'm in favour of mergers, but it also means, again, that means you have to answer the governance question, because I can't now currently force any force to merge if I were the police minister, because I've got two elected positions, and we have to, in a sense, have that localism as well. Stevens will, I think, look at the issue of whether there is collaboration which is effectively leading to mergers. If you're looking now at Essex and Kent, Norfolk and Suffolk, to a lesser extent Hanson Beds, West Mercia, and they're looking at effectively joined up forces. Now the question is, does the Police and Crime Commissioner model need to be reformed in that way? And these are issues that I haven't genuinely got answers to yet, because we've got to work through both the 12-month experience we've not yet had, but also some of the conclusions that Stephen's coming to. But those are things that are on the agenda, and I think post the 2015 election we've got to look at all of that in a first-year Labour government. But we've got to make it clear at the election as well, to get the mandate to do those things.
Thank you. Perhaps PCCs can, as I'm sure they will, meet jointly in those areas where they collaborate, and those mergers will de facto happen on the ground, and there'll be simply another meeting for all those PCCs to go to. But,
I didn't quite recognise what you said about PCCs seem to be driving forces away from collaboration.
I
Because
didn't say that. No. I said that's one of the challenges we've got to face, is how we get more collaboration.
yeah, because I mean my experience is that PCCs are actually driving greater collaboration, and whereas perhaps in the past it was chief constables who were kind of nervous about it and wanted to protect their false identity and all that sort of, actually PCCs can see the big advantages of collaboration.
My only contention, Olly, is that we need to have, in my view, more collaboration, And when you have a fragmented system, in the past, I could mandate potentially from the Home Office as a minister to collaborate on certain things, and as a minister I did do that. I've got much more difficulty in mandating now an elected person who might take a different view. Now you might be driving collaboration locally, but I was trying to point the centralism, localism dilemma is there more than ever before.
Can I just make one intervention on this, and then we've got some response from the floor. The only thing I would say, David, is this: just be a bit cautious, because actually some of the collaboration that I want to achieve isn't necessarily with other police forces.
No, that's absolutely.
It's with at the moment we're looking at some fairly obvious things. Do we need all the kind of notional the backroom staff all run by? Does GMP need its own HR structure? Does it need its own payroll structure, etc.? But is the best person or the best organisation actually Cheshire or Merseyside Police Force, or is it in fact actually Tameside Council? So the kind of mergers you want, the collaboration you want to enforce, you have the same difficulty, frankly, if the logic is actually with Tameside Council, because as policing minister, you will not be able to tell Tameside Council to do anything at all. I probably can at local level. I don't say that in an assertive way. I mean, so could other structures at local level, but it probably has to be generated.
Okay, I think we should invite contributions from the floor. Robin.
Thanks very much, really interesting presentation. David, can I just clarify, I know you don't want to be drawn too much, but you mapped out
Not yet.
you mapped out the options as I heard it, and option A was pretty much status quo with a bit of tweaking maybe. Option C was super PCCs given the whole shooting match. And your option, I thought there was an option there which was going to be scrap them, but I didn't hear you say that. I heard you say amend them, strengthen the panels, bring in the local authorities.
There is an option to scrap.
Okay, so
But the question was scrap. I mean, again, the question with scrap is
what do you
replace them with?
Yeah.
And that's why, again, I might sound evasive in this. I'm not trying to be. What I'm trying to say is, at the moment, we've got a position whereby we're not yet 12 months into PCCs. There's a range of good practice going on. We've got the Stevens review, which has been looking at a whole range of issues for 18 months. That's going to report shortly, before probably the end of October. We've then got to assess all of those general views. I have, of various views, other people do, but it's the party needs to decide.
Yeah, but is it a party view, that Tony's view, that the local authority scrutiny was crap and not fit for purpose? Is that a Labour Party view of the older arrangements?
Well, again, if I
Let's just take a couple of contributions from the floor as well. Yes. Thank you.
Thanks, Ruth Castle from Airway. You mentioned efficiencies in local council. What about the fire service? Would you consider either collaborating or merging with the fire service?
Well, yes, but again, look at what policing does. Look at what the fire service does. It's tempting to draw the conclusion because they wear blue uniforms, they must do pretty much the same thing. In actual fact, what modern policing has got more in common with is probably not necessarily the fire and rescue. It's probably got more in common with lots of other agencies. So the kind of partnerships that you want to build. I mean, with the fire and rescue service, obviously things like call handling would be the obvious areas. Maybe some kind of form of co-location. Could you have common governance? I know it's a suggestion. I'm not particularly pushing for that, I must say. But could it be done? Yes, of course it could be done. And in some areas of the country, I know that amongst police and crime commissioners, there is the kind of quite advanced conversation taking place with exactly the fire service. But it isn't necessarily, I just want to stress this, the commonality is that we need to build, the partnerships we really need to build are in some ways dead obvious, but in some ways ones that are surprising. As I said before, it's probably better, frankly, if I'm building partnership with mental health services than with the fire service after time I see. But that sounds dismissive because actually, I mean, where there are, I mean, I'll give you one quick example actually. Funnily enough, the people who probably go into more homes with more goodwill from the home occupiers is in actual fact the fire service, because lots of what they do is around going in, explaining why you're going to kill yourself if you don't have a smoke alarm, etc., etc. You're looking up for the smoke alarm to make sure it's working. What that does mean is they have great capacity to maybe do other things. And one thing that we're looking at is whether the fire service actually could do a quick check on things like for vulnerable groups of people, things like window locks, proper door security, that kind of stuff. That would be a good form of cooperation, but you don't need common governance and common ownership to derive that kind of partnership working.
Any other contributions?
Yeah, I was just going to say, kind of on the national local debate, I suppose, but I'm from Chamber of Revolving Doors Agency, we're a charity for system change around repeat offenders with multiple and complex needs, as many of them have. So that is kind of that kind of partnership work, and I was really pleased to hear Tony say about thinking systemically, thinking about the whole system working together. And I spoke to Olly's assistant PCC the other day, and I know there's a lot of work going on there, looking at the pathways that people take that leads them into repeat contact or into gangs. So then you can see the system, points of the system that the failure is happening, that lead them into contact with the police. And that kind of local partnership is really something that can only be done at a local level to pull people together. And a lot of those local partnerships are very dependent on what's about locally and are very fragile. So I suppose it's a plea really that any tinkering going on kind of bears that into mind, and it comes on the back of a serious review of all the partnership and local working going on at a local level. And this like we're sort of doing that at the moment around multiple complex needs.
I think there's a very there's an important catalyst role that I certainly feel I'm playing. I'm sure it's the same Tony described. So one of the things I've done is we're setting up a criminal justice demand reduction board that's bringing together CSPs, health, local criminal justice board, so getting all the players around the table, and then looking at that whole early intervention and prevention agenda. And that's the and crime bit of the role. It's the newest bit really. We've inherited the police governance from the police authorities, but this and crime thing is the new bit. And I think we are. I certainly feel like. In some ways, I'm quite amazed. It seemed to me obvious that these people should be round the table talking to one another, and yet it hasn't happened, certainly in my part of the world, until I've come along and said, right, we're going to set this board up and we're going to start looking at how we can work together on these issues. And I agree that it's important, whatever we move forward with, that new bit of the jigsaw that PCCs have brought about isn't lost.
Thank you, Olly. I think we've had a good discussion. I would just like to say, since we are sitting here in Brighton, which is the home of Grey and Green, Brighton Rock, Pinky and so on, but it's perhaps not widely known that the reason why police authorities were first set up in 1964 were a series of corruption scandals in the late 50s, one of the major ones of which was involved the chairman of the Brighton Watch Committee and his relationship with the assistant chief constable of the Brighton Force, and their very lucrative and ongoing relationship with the razor gangs from London who operated on Brighton Racecourse, which ended up with both the chief constable and the chairman of the watch committee in the dock of the Old Bailey. I'm not suggesting anyway that that's how PCC is going to end up, but it's just a historical note that here we are in Brighton, and that's one of the main reasons for the last time there was a major change in the governance of the police. So I want to thank you all for coming at such an early hour, and thank you for taking part in such an interesting discussion. Thank you.